The sun rose slowly over Atlanta, Georgia. The year was 1929. The morning light was soft and golden. It spilled over the rooftops of quiet wooden houses. Oak trees lined the streets. Their leaves shimmered gently in the warm breeze. The air smelled of fresh cut grass and blooming magnolias. In a small neighborhood called Sweet Auburn, life moved at a steady, peaceful pace. A young boy named Martin Luther King Jr. lived here with his family. Their home was a modest two-story house. It had a wide front porch where the family often sat in the evenings. The sounds of neighbors talking and children playing drifted through the air. This was a community of hardworking people. They were teachers, preachers, and shopkeepers. They knew each other's names and looked after one another. Everything felt safe and familiar. The streets were clean and lined with well-kept gardens. In the early mornings, the milkman made his rounds. His horse-drawn wagon clattered softly over the brick roads. Martin often watched from the window. He saw the world waking up slowly. The day would bring new lessons and new sights. But for now, the world was still and quiet. The boy's room was simple. There was a wooden bed with a patchwork quilt. A small desk held a Bible and a few books. Sunlight streamed through the lace curtains. It cast gentle patterns on the floor. From his window, he could see the steeple of Ebenezer Baptist Church. His father was the pastor there. The church stood tall and proud. Its white bricks glowed in the morning sun. The sound of church bells rang out on Sundays. They called the faithful to prayer. Martin's mother taught him to read when he was very young. She sat with him in the kitchen. The stove was warm. The smell of biscuits and coffee filled the room. She read him stories from the Bible. They were stories of hope and compassion. Martin listened carefully. He learned that words had power. They could heal or they could harm. He chose to use them for good. On some afternoons, his father took him for walks. They strolled down Auburn Avenue. The street was busy but not chaotic. People greeted each other with warm hellos. The barbershop was open. The sound of laughter came from inside. The grocery store had barrels of apples and sacks of flour. The world seemed full of simple joys. Martin watched his father shake hands with everyone. He noticed how his father carried himself with dignity. He held his head high and spoke with a calm voice. Martin wanted to be like him one day. The days were long and warm. The summer sun climbed high in the sky. Martin played with his friends in the yard. They chased each other under the shade of old trees. They played hide and seek among the bushes. The grass was soft beneath their feet. In the distance, the sound of a train whistle echoed. It was a lonesome sound, but it did not disturb the peace. Life in Sweet Auburn flowed like a gentle river. The evenings were the most beautiful time. The sky turned shades of orange and pink. The air became cooler. The porch swing creaked softly. Martin's mother and father sat together in the twilight. They spoke in low voices about the day's events. Martin sat on the steps. He watched the fireflies begin to glow. They blinked in the dimming light. The world felt safe. It felt whole. He did not yet understand the struggles that lay ahead. For now, he was just a boy in Atlanta. He was surrounded by love and community. He was learning the rhythms of life. He was learning about kindness and faith. This childhood was a foundation. It was built on steady ground. It would hold him steady in the storms to come. The stars appeared one by one. The night sky deepened into a soft velvet blue. Martin went inside. He climbed the stairs to his room. The window was open. A gentle breeze carried the scent of jasmine. He said his prayers and lay down. The day was done. The world was at peace. The church bells of Ebenezer Baptist Church rang every Sunday. Their sound was deep and resonant. It carried across the neighborhood like a warm embrace. Young Martin walked with his family down Auburn Avenue. He wore his best suit. It was a little stiff but clean. His shoes were polished. His hair was combed neatly. The family moved together in a slow, steady rhythm. Other families joined them on the walk. They greeted each other with smiles and nods. The church doors were wide open. Warm golden light spilled out onto the steps. Inside, the pews were made of dark polished wood. The stained glass windows showed scenes from the Bible. The morning sun shone through them. It painted the floor in hues of blue and red and gold. The air smelled of old books and fresh flowers. There was a quiet reverence in the room. People found their seats. They whispered softly to one another. Then the choir began to sing. The voices rose together in harmony. They sang old hymns of hope and deliverance. The sound filled every corner of the sanctuary. It was like a river of warmth. Martin sat between his mother and father. He felt the music in his chest. He listened to every word. The sermon that day was about love. Its theme was about loving your neighbor. It was about forgiving those who wronged you. The words settled into Martin's heart. They became part of him. After the service, the congregation gathered outside. The sun was higher now. It felt warm on their faces. People talked and laughed. Children ran on the grass. The church was not just a building. It was the center of the community. It was a place of strength and peace. On weekdays, the church was quiet. But Martin often visited. He would sit alone in a pew. He listened to the silence. The light from the windows moved slowly across the floor. He felt a sense of calm. He felt a connection to something greater than himself. The church taught him about justice. It taught him that every person has worth. These lessons stayed with him. He carried them into every part of his life. The bell tower rose above the church. Its bell was cast from bronze. It had been ringing for decades. It called people to worship. It announced weddings and funerals. It marked the passage of time. One afternoon, Martin climbed the stairs to the bell tower. He stood at the top and looked out over the city. The rooftops stretched into the distance. The trees swayed in the wind. He could see for miles. The world seemed peaceful from this height. He imagined all the people living their lives below. He thought about their joys and their sorrows. He wanted to help them. He wanted his life to mean something. The bell hung beside him. It was silent now, but he could feel its weight. He knew that one day he would have to ring it. He would call people to action. But for now, he just stood there. He breathed in the air. He listened to the quiet. The church remained a constant presence in his life. It was a harbor in every storm. As he grew older, the church shaped his voice. He learned to speak from the pulpit. He learned to use his words to comfort and inspire. The ceiling of the sanctuary was high and arched. The wooden beams were aged and strong. The light always seemed to glow there. It filtered through the colored glass. It created a mosaic of light. This was the world of his youth. A world of faith and music. A world of community and calm. The sound of the bell stayed with him forever. Martin loved to read. He found comfort in the quiet world of books. The public library in Atlanta was a grand old building. It stood on a tree-lined street. Its columns were made of white stone. The steps were worn smooth by years of visitors. Martin walked up those steps slowly. He pushed open the heavy wooden door. Inside, the air was cool and still. The smell of old paper and leather filled the room. Tall windows let in soft white light. Dust motes floated in the sunbeams. The floors were made of creaking wood. Every footstep echoed gently. Martin walked between the tall shelves. His fingers traced the spines of the books. There were volumes of history and philosophy. There were biographies of great leaders. There were novels with stories of faraway places. He pulled out a book and sat at a large wooden table. The chair was comfortable. The silence was complete. He could hear the turning of pages. He could hear his own breathing. He read about Mahatma Gandhi. He read about nonviolence and civil disobedience. He read about the power of love in the face of hatred. These ideas took root in his mind. They grew into something strong and beautiful. The library became a sanctuary for him. He spent many afternoons there. The shadows moved slowly across the room. The hours passed without notice. Sometimes he was the only person there. The librarian was a kind woman. She wore her hair in a neat bun. She always smiled at Martin. She helped him find the books he needed. She knew he was a special young man. She saw the way he read. He read with deep concentration. He underlined passages. He wrote notes in a small journal. She left him alone to his thoughts. She understood that some minds need space. The desk where he sat had a lamp with a green glass shade. It cast a warm circle of light onto the page. Outside the window, the world went on. Carriages passed by. People walked on the sidewalks. But inside the library, time seemed to stop. Martin entered a different realm. It was a realm of ideas and dreams. He learned about the great thinkers of history. He learned about Socrates and Plato. He learned about Thoreau and Emerson. They spoke of justice and truth. They spoke of the dignity of the human soul. Martin felt a connection to them. They were voices from the past. But they spoke to him directly. They encouraged him to think deeply. They urged him to act with courage. The library had a reading room with a high ceiling. A large portrait of Abraham Lincoln hung on the wall. Lincoln's face was kind and tired. His eyes looked forward. Martin often gazed at that portrait. He thought about the Emancipation Proclamation. He thought about the struggle for freedom. He felt that he was part of a long story. He was part of a movement that began long before he was born. The weight of history rested on his shoulders. But it did not crush him. It inspired him. He knew that change was possible. He knew that ordinary people could do extraordinary things. The library closed at 6 o'clock. The librarian would gently remind him. He would close his book. He would gather his things. He walked out into the evening air. The sky was often pink and orange. The streetlights were beginning to glow. He felt calm. He felt ready for the next day. Books were his teachers. They were his friends. They showed him a world beyond his own. They gave him the tools to build a better future. He carried their lessons in his heart. The reading room remained in his memory. It was a place of quiet light. It was a place where dreams were born. At the age of 15, Martin entered Morehouse College. The campus was a collection of old brick buildings. Ivy grew up the walls. Large oak trees shaded the pathways. The grass was green and well-kept. Students walked slowly between classes. They carried books under their arms. They talked in low voices. The air was filled with the sound of birds. Morehouse was a place of learning and tradition. It was a place where young men became leaders. Martin lived in a dormitory. His room was small but comfortable. It had a single bed and a desk. A window looked out onto the courtyard. In the mornings, he woke to the sound of the chapel bell. He dressed and walked to the dining hall. The dining hall was a large room with long wooden tables. The windows were high and let in plenty of light. The students ate together. They talked about philosophy and politics. They debated ideas late into the night. Martin listened more than he spoke at first. He absorbed everything around him. His professors were wise men. They challenged him to think critically. They taught him about history and ethics. They encouraged him to find his own voice. One professor was a man named Dr. Benjamin Mays. He was the president of the college. He was a tall man with a deep voice. He often spoke about the power of nonviolence. He believed that love could conquer hate. Martin was deeply influenced by him. He saw in Dr. Mays a model of dignity and grace. He wanted to become such a man. The library at Morehouse was a beautiful building. It had tall columns and a grand entrance. Inside, the reading room was lined with portraits of scholars. Martin spent hours there. He read the works of Walter Rauschenbusch. He learned about the social gospel. He learned that faith must be lived out in action. It was not enough to believe. One must serve others. One must fight for justice. These ideas resonated with him. They gave his life a sense of purpose. The campus had a chapel at its center. It was a simple building with a wooden cross. Students gathered there for weekly services. The singing was heartfelt. The prayers were earnest. Martin often sat in the front row. He felt a deep peace in that space. The light came through clear glass windows. It illuminated the faces of his fellow students. They were all searching for meaning. They were all hoping for a better world. In his second year, Martin joined the debate team. He learned to speak with clarity and conviction. He learned to structure his arguments. He learned to persuade with logic and emotion. The debate hall was a small room with a podium. The audience of students sat quietly. Martin stood at the podium. His voice was steady. He spoke about the need for racial equality. He spoke about the dignity of all people. His words moved his listeners. They felt the truth in what he said. The college experience shaped Martin. It taught him discipline. It taught him hope. It showed him that knowledge is a light. It can illuminate the darkest corners. The years at Morehouse passed quickly. They were filled with study and friendship. They were filled with quiet walks under the trees. They were filled with long conversations on the lawn. The sunsets over the campus were beautiful. The sky turned every shade of gold and red. Martin often sat on the steps of the library. He watched the day end. He felt grateful for this time. He felt prepared for what lay ahead. He graduated with a degree in sociology. But more than that, he graduated with a mission. The college had given him roots. It had given him wings. He was ready to fly. In 1954, Martin moved to Montgomery, Alabama. He became the pastor of Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. The church was a small brick building. It stood near the state capitol. The street was lined with old trees. The leaves rustled in the warm wind. The church had a simple sanctuary. The pews were made of dark wood. The pulpit stood at the front. Behind it was a large window. It let in soft light during the day. Martin stood at that pulpit for the first time. He looked out at his new congregation. They were kind faces. They were hopeful eyes. They welcomed him with open hearts. He felt a sense of belonging. This was his new home. The parsonage was a modest house. It was located on South Jackson Street. It had a small front yard with a rose bush. The porch had a swing. Martin and his wife Coretta sat there in the evenings. They watched the neighborhood settle down for the night. The streetlights came on one by one. The crickets began to chirp. The air was warm and still. Coretta played the piano inside. The music drifted through the open windows. It was a peaceful life. Martin prepared his sermons in a small study. The study had a desk and a bookshelf. A lamp cast a warm glow onto the papers. He wrote by hand. He chose his words carefully. Each sermon was a message of hope. Each sermon was a call for justice. The church was the center of the community. It was a place of refuge. It was a place of strength. Montgomery was a city of contrasts. There were beautiful old homes with white columns. There were quiet streets lined with magnolia trees. But there was also deep division. Martin saw the signs of segregation everywhere. Separate water fountains. Separate sections on buses. He felt the weight of injustice. But he did not despair. He believed that change was coming. He believed that love would prevail. In 1955, Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat. She was arrested. The news spread quickly through the city. Martin and other leaders met in the church basement. They planned a bus boycott. They would walk instead of ride. They would protest peacefully. The days of the boycott were long. People walked to work in the early morning. They walked home in the evening. The sun rose and set on their determination. The streets of Montgomery became a stage for courage. Martin led from the front. He spoke at mass meetings. His voice was calm but powerful. He told the people to love their enemies. He told them to pray for those who persecuted them. The words echoed in the church. They echoed in the hearts of the people. The parsonage was bombed one night. Martin and Coretta were inside. But they were not harmed. A crowd gathered outside. They were angry. They wanted revenge. Martin stood on his porch. He spoke to them. He told them to go home peacefully. He said violence is not the answer. The crowd listened. They dispersed. The night was quiet again. The moonlight shone on the damaged house. Martin stood there for a long time. He felt a deep sense of peace. He knew that he was walking the right path. The boycott lasted 381 days. It ended with a Supreme Court ruling. Segregation on buses was unconstitutional. It was a victory. It was a step forward. Martin learned that nonviolence works. It had the power to change the world. The year in Montgomery was a season of struggle, but it was also a season of grace. The people had come together. They had supported each other. They had walked in faith. The streets of Montgomery became sacred ground. Every step was a prayer. Every step was a hope for a better tomorrow. The summer of 1963 was hot and bright. The Lincoln Memorial stood tall in Washington, D.C. Its white marble gleamed in the sunlight. The reflecting pool stretched out before it. The water was calm and blue. Hundreds of thousands of people gathered on the National Mall. They came from every corner of the country. They came by bus and by train. They came on foot. They were old and young. They were black and white. They came together in peace. The air was filled with the sound of singing. Voices rose in unity. They sang "We shall overcome." They sang with hope. They sang with joy. Martin stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. He looked out at the vast crowd. The scene was breathtaking. Faces stretched as far as the eye could see. They were all waiting. They were all hoping. He adjusted his notes. The sun was warm on his face. A gentle breeze blew across the steps. He began to speak. His voice was calm. It was steady. It carried across the mall. He spoke about a dream. It was not a new dream. It was an old dream. It was the dream of equality. It was the dream of freedom. He said, "I have a dream." The words echoed off the marble walls. They rose into the blue sky. The crowd listened in silence. They felt the truth of his words. They felt the power of his vision. The image of that day is etched into memory. The white marble of the memorial. The blue sky above. The sea of faces below. It was a moment of pure hope. It was a moment when the world paused. Martin spoke of his children. He dreamed that they would be judged by their character, not by the color of their skin. His voice became more passionate, but it never lost its calm. It was the voice of a prophet. It was the voice of a gentle leader. The speech lasted just over 16 minutes, but its impact lasted forever. When he finished, there was a moment of silence. Then the crowd erupted in applause. People hugged each other. They cried. The dream had been spoken aloud. It was now alive in the world. The afternoon sun began to descend. The shadows on the grass grew longer. The crowd slowly began to disperse. They walked back toward the buses. They carried the dream with them. Martin stood on the steps for a moment longer. He looked at the reflecting pool. The water was still. The sky was turning golden. He felt a deep sense of peace. He had done his part. The March on Washington was a peaceful gathering. There was no violence. There was no anger. There was only hope. It was a testament to the power of nonviolence. It showed that change is possible. It showed that love is stronger than hate. The monument to Abraham Lincoln stood behind Martin. The great emancipator looked on. He had dreamed of a united country. Now another voice had taken up the dream. The two men were connected across time. They were both builders of a better world. The evening came softly. The lights of the city began to glow. The National Mall was quiet once more. The grass was slightly worn from the day's gathering. But the peace remained. The dream remained. It would never fade away. The years after the March on Washington were filled with hard work. Martin traveled from city to city. He spoke in churches and town halls. He met with community leaders. He organized peaceful protests. The work was tiring, but he never gave up. He believed that justice would come. He believed that love would win. In 1964, he received the Nobel Peace Prize. The ceremony was in Oslo, Norway. The city was covered in snow. The buildings were old and beautiful. The streets were quiet. Martin walked through the snow. He felt a deep sense of gratitude. The prize was a symbol. It showed that the world was watching. It showed that the struggle was recognized. He gave an acceptance speech. He spoke about nonviolence. He spoke about the power of love. The audience listened in silence. They were moved by his words. He returned to the United States. The work continued. There were new challenges. There were new cities to visit. There were new injustices to confront. He went to Selma, Alabama. The Edmund Pettus Bridge spanned the Alabama River. The bridge was long and arched. The water below was brown and slow. On March 7, 1965, peaceful marchers were attacked. Martin led a second march. He stopped at the bridge and prayed. The marchers knelt in the road. They were met with force. But they did not fight back. They turned around and walked back. The image of that day is powerful. It shows the strength of nonviolence. It shows the courage of ordinary people. The Voting Rights Act was passed later that year. It was a victory. It was a step forward. But Martin knew the journey was not over. He turned his attention to economic justice. He saw that poverty affected all races. He planned a poor people's campaign. He wanted to bring people together. He wanted to build a movement for economic equality. The work was exhausting, but he found rest in small moments. He spent time with his children. He played with them in the yard. He read them stories at bedtime. Their laughter was a source of peace. He walked in the garden. He watched the flowers bloom. He felt the sun on his face. These were moments of grace. They reminded him why he fought. They reminded him of the beauty of life. The civil rights movement was a long river. It flowed through many landscapes. There were smooth stretches. There were rapids and rocks. But the river never stopped. It kept moving toward the sea. Martin was the one who kept the course. He was the steady hand at the helm. He spoke to crowds in the rain. He spoke in the heat of summer. He spoke in the cold of winter. His voice never wavered. He always spoke of hope. He always spoke of love. The church in Montgomery became a pilgrimage site. People came to see where it all began. They sat in the pews. They walked through the doors. They felt the spirit of the movement. The dream was alive. It was growing. It was spreading across the land. The years of struggle were not easy, but they were meaningful. They were filled with purpose. Martin knew that history was on his side. He knew that the arc of the moral universe bends toward justice. He held on to that belief. It sustained him. It gave him strength. It was the spring of 1968. Martin was in Memphis, Tennessee. He was supporting striking sanitation workers. The city was warm. The trees were beginning to bud. The air smelled of new life. He stayed at the Lorraine Motel. The motel was a modest building. It had a balcony on the second floor. Martin often stood there in the evening. He looked out at the city. The street was busy but calm. The sun set behind the buildings. The sky turned a deep shade of orange. He talked with his colleagues. They planned the next day's events. He felt a sense of peace. He had been fighting for so long. He was tired, but he was hopeful. On the evening of April 4th, Martin stepped onto the balcony. The air was warm and still. He spoke with friends below. He laughed. He smiled. He was in good spirits. The light was golden. It was the golden hour before sunset. He leaned on the railing. He looked toward the horizon. He was a man at rest. He had given everything to the movement. He had poured out his heart. He had loved deeply. He had sacrificed greatly. A single shot rang out. It broke the quiet of the evening. Martin fell. The world seemed to stop. Time hung in the air. The light began to fade. The golden sky turned to violet. The city of Memphis grew still. People gathered in the street. They wept. They prayed. But there was no anger. There was only sorrow. There was only love. Martin Luther King Jr. was gone. But his dream remained. The Lorraine Motel became a quiet place. The balcony was left as it was. A wreath was placed on the railing. People came to stand in silence. They looked at the spot where he stood. They felt his presence. They felt his peace. The world mourned. But the world also celebrated. It celebrated his life. It celebrated his message. The funeral was held at Ebenezer Baptist Church. The church was filled with people. They sang the old hymns. They listened to his recorded voice. He had said that he wanted to be remembered as a drum major for justice. He wanted to be remembered as someone who loved. He lived that message to the very end. The coffin was carried through the streets of Atlanta. People lined the sidewalks. They stood in silence. The sun was bright. The air was warm. It was a spring day, the season of new beginnings. He was buried at the King Center. A simple tomb was built. It is surrounded by a pool of water. The water is still and calm. Visitors walk around it. They read the words carved in stone. Free at last. Free at last. Thank God Almighty, I am free at last. His journey was complete. The dream was now in the hands of others. The light of his life continues to shine. It illuminates the path for all who seek justice. It guides the way toward a world of peace. The evening of his death was a tragedy, but the morning after brought hope. The sun rose again. The birds sang. The flowers bloomed. Life continued. And the dream lived on. It lives on in every act of kindness, in every word of love, in every step toward justice. Martin Luther King Jr. rests in peace. His work is done. His legacy is eternal. The world is better because he lived. And his dream will never die.